Basta prendere un campione di ossidiana.
One just has to take a piece of obsidian, split it, and it can be clearly seen that it forms a razor-sharp blade. Refining this blade with little blows, one can produce a knife, or the point of an arrow, etc.
L'isolotto di Strombolicchio.
The little islet of Strombolicchio touched on 60 meters in maximum height against the actual 49 meters today, as a result of the construction of the lighthouse that is on its peak, which first exploded with light at the end of the 19th century. Here we find ourselves in the heart of the spent crater of Monte Fossa delle Felci, where we can find chestnut trees that are centuries old. The initial core part of the Regional Archaeological Museum of Lipari, today named after Luigi Bernabo Brea, was established in the second half of the 1940s. Its date of birth as a museum goes back to 1954. In the South Tyrrhenian Sea, there are a handful of islands of volcanic origin, very well known by tourists and pleasure boats, but also by scientists around the world. Limpid and uncontaminated waters, splendid sceneries, bays, dream berths, and diversified characters from island to island welcome in summer tourists that too often, however, remain strangers to the true essence to these islands. Only the experts understand the intimate essence, always to be rediscovered and deepened, that render them however unique in the entire Mediterranean. To know these islands well means also to retrace an extremely ancient history, unique and rare, that wanders from the high life of Panarea. To the country life of Lipari. From the exotic Stromboli, or from the shelters of Polara. Getting to know the islands, we can retrace not only certain stretches of the long and troubled adventures of man, but also the geological history of the South Tyrrhenian Sea. Here also, the evolution of animal and vegetable species provide a unique example of the context of our country. Vulcano is the home of the god of the underworld. Mythology places in its inflamed interior the hotbed of the god that forged weapons for the gods and the heroes with the heat of the magma that came from the bowels of the earth. This island gives its name to all the mountains of our planet, small and large, formed by volcanic activity.
Vulcano, Iera, l'isola sacra.
Volcano Hierra. The sacred island has always been considered by the ancients as a place where one could find the gods that presided over the forces of nature. And this continued throughout the classical age as well as the Christian age. For example, Saint Gregorio Magno places the mouth of hell there and recounts how Teodorico was thrown into the crater by Pope Giovanni and by the patrician Simaco. The geological history of Volcano becomes lost in the mists of time, but we can retrace it starting from 127,000 years ago, when it began to emerge from the sea. And so, slowly there formed a volcanic structure much larger than the one we see today. With a bit of imagination, this is how the antique volcanic cone would have looked. For 20,000 years, explosive and effusive eruptions followed one after another. That grew the island until, due to intense tectonic volcanic events, following the construction of the most ancient volcano, the top part collapses. And so forms a huge hollow, the Caldera del Piano, that in time became filled with products of successive eruptions. The face of the new volcanic structure is, however, destined once again to change. Around 15,000 years after the demolition of the top part, the northern part of the caldera collapses. Despite the radical change to the morphology of the island, the volcanic activity persistently continues in the various centers located on the borders and at the interior of the caldera that was previously formed, until around 15,000 years ago, when the effusion of viscous lava gives rise to the domes of Monte della Lentia.
Sappiamo che il Citiso viveva a Lipari, come testimoniato dalle impronte fossili.
We know that the Cytisus existed at Lipari, as is evidenced by the fossil imprints. We also know that it lived on other islands, but we have no traces of it. However, today it survives with 3 populations: at Volcano, where there is half the world's population, at Stromboli, and a small group at Alicudi. The Cytisus of the Aeolians is the giant of its type. This group of leguminous shrubs does not normally exceed more than 2 to 3 meters in height. The various species found in Italy do not exceed the shrub-like appearance. Instead, this plant, exclusive to the Aeolian Islands, manages to exceed 7 to 8 meters in height, as is often the case in the islands, where many dwarf species tend to be gigantic, and many gigantic species tend to be dwarf-like, the so-called syndrome of insularity. It is in navigating to the west of Volcano that even the less expert can recognize the frequent collection of fused scoria of Spiaggia Lunga. The fused scoria are evidence of a volcanic activity of the type of fountains lava, which originate from an eruptive crack on the border of the old caldera. Today, the most interesting and attractive eruptive center is that of La Fassa, located on the northern part of the island. This volcanic cone formed inside a second tectonic volcanic depression, La Caldera della Fassa. After violent explosive eruptions and more limited lava effusions, the construction of the cone is completed with the eruption of 1888 to 1890.
Quando noi individuiamo queste bombe, che sono per esempio tipiche di Vulcano,
When we see these bombs, which are typical of Volcano, we know that volcanism, at least in the phase in which it has produced these bombs, is phreatomagmatico or hydromagmatico. This is the piece of a volcanic bomb, that is, a piece of lava projected while still plastic, that assumes an ellipsoidal shape during projection. After it falls, it loses, in a violent manner, the gas that is within it, creating the fractures on the surface. This is called a bread crust bomb, and is indicative of a presence of a gas within. But the physiognomy of the house of the gods of the underworld changes yet again. In the 2nd century before Christ, is born from the sea, like an island in itself, Vulcanello. Today, Volcano attracts many tourists for the splendor of its coasts, for the fascination of the crater of La Fassa that is easily accessible, and for the signs of activity that can be found in its waters and in its warm and beneficial muds. But the volcanic apparatus of La Fassa, precisely for the explosive character of its eruptions, remains one of the most dangerous volcanoes of the Mediterranean. Melegunis, mountain of honey, so the ancient Greeks called Lipare. The ancient volcanic activity at Lipari has given origin to some thermal springs. The famous thermal baths of San Calogero are found right above the Palmetto area.
Siamo su questo sentiero impervio della costa occidentale di Lipari ed esattamente in località Palmetto.
We are on this path on the west coast of Lipari, more precisely in the area of Palmetto, that gets its name from the species that is the object of our visit, the dwarf palm, the only native palm of the western Mediterranean. The dwarf palm, like all the similar species, surely loves the hot climates, and today is very localized, whereas at one time it was more widespread. It belonged to a type of vegetation that grew around a lake that existed around 100,000 years ago when the climate was warmer. Along with this species were present bay leaf trees, the cytisus of the Eolians. The cliffs of the Tempone Patasso retell the story of a lake that existed 100,000 years ago, filled by the pyroclastics emitted by the eruption of Monte Angelo. And in this filling process were included some plants that lived on the border of the lake. Today we find in the fossils the documentation of the flora almost completely extinct and not comparable with that which exists today.
Qui siamo alla base della falesia di Tempone Patasso.
Here we are at the base of the cliff of Tempone Patasso. This is the imprint of a bay leaf that is present today in the domestic state, in the sense that it is cultivated in the gardens and used as an officinal and food plant. But at one time was present and formed some true forests, a little similar to the Laure Silva present today in Canary Islands.
Particolarmente rilevanti in questo museo sono gli aspetti che riguardano
Particularly prominent in this museum are the aspects that concern the pots of the painter of Lipari, which, if they don't in some way commence the history of color in paintings, they are, however, of great importance.
E poi I modellini di maschere.
And then the little models of masks that represented an extremely rich and very important collection. In the museum, we have around 1,000 pieces of theatrical terracottas that provide the evidence of this enormous activity that was developing in Lipari. And then, furthermore, the underwater archaeology that collects not only the finds that were casually recovered, but that come from the first systematic underwater digs that were carried out. Apart from the spectacularity of the exhibition, the finds on display are directly linked to the wreckages from which they come. The Archaeological Museum of Lipari in recent years has been enriched with the addition of two detached sections, the first on the island of Filicudi and the second on the island of Panaria. The island of Lipari is more ancient than that of Vulcano. The scientists recovered the first volcanic products emerged from the sea 100,000 years ago before the emergence of Vulcano. The geological history of the largest island of the archipelago begins in fact 220,000 years ago and is very long and complex. The style of the volcanic activity is varied in time and space, On the island, it is possible to distinguish varied movements and volcanological aspects. From the summit of Monte Sant'Angelo, one dominates all of Lipari. We are on the second highest peak of the island, a volcanic cone that formed in around 30,000 years. After a period in which were active a series of small volcanic centers, Timponi, localized in the western sector of the island, and today in part dismantled by erosion, came to form Monte Sant'Angelo. After 40,000 years of inactivity in the southern sector of the island, there were before long frequent explosions caused by the meeting of rising magma with the water, to which follows the effusion of viscous lavas, and so came to form the rounded lava domes that characterize the southern part of the island, among which is that of the Castello de Lipari, which today contains the regional archaeological and the volcanological museums.
Il primo nucleo di questo museo viene fondato intorno alla seconda metà
The
degli
first
anni
nucleus of this
40,
museum was founded around the second half of the 1940s,
di Lipari,
when in the Technical Commercial Institute of Lipari, as a result of the desire and the work carried out by its director, were displayed the finds that belonged to various collections. But the geological story of the island of Lipari does not end with the formation of the domes. In the last 10 to 15,000 years, there is evidence at Lipari of a volcanological phenomenon that heavily conditions, as we have seen, not only everyday life of the population of the island, but also of the Mediterranean. In the northeastern sector, huge eruptions created the thick blanket of pumice and the flows of obsidian, the sharp black volcanic glass that comes to constitute the future and the essence of the first Aeolian civilization. It is this presence of obsidian that pushed man, until the Neolithic, to first wander and to later establish itself at Lipari and its surrounding islands. Obsidian constituted, in fact, that precious fountain of riches that came to be exported without great competition to shores that were far away from Sicily and southern Italy.
Potremmo dire, se limitassimo la nostra attenzione a questa parte,
Focusing our attention on this area of the Mediterranean, we can say that it has been concerned with a true and proper civilization of obsidian, for the relations that this population has entertained with other inhabitants of the Mediterranean coast. The trade of this material made Lipari prosper, to the point that it rapidly became the propelling center of the civilizations of that period, one of the most densely populated human settlements of the entire Mediterranean. It is via this obsidian that the archipelago acquires life and fame, undergoing, throughout the centuries, alternating phases of prosperity and decline, and writes a fascinating chapter in the history of man. The flow of the Rocche Rosse is one of the most famous flows in the world because it is an extremely beautiful flow of obsidian. It is in the 18th century after Christ that there was the last eruption at Lipari. This created the cone of pumice of Monte Palato, whose crater emitted the spectacular flow of obsidian of Rocche Rosse. However, it must be stressed that it is not the flow, it is not the obsidian that Neolithic man used for the construction of equipment that created the fortune of the Aeolian Islands in the past. As we are already in the Middle Ages, and obsidian from several millennia is no longer a material so important and precious,
La maggior parte
The
dell'ossidiana
majority of the obsidian used by Neolithic man came from the flow of Gabellotto Fiume Bianco. However, while pumice loses all its gas during the throes of the explosion, obsidian retains its gas within during the flow.
l'attività estrattiva ha demolito.
The mining activity has demolished all the eastern edge of the cone of pumice of Monte Pilato. The intense mining activity has exposed the internal structure of this cone of pumice that would otherwise have been covered with vegetation and be preserved in its entirety. Here we find ourselves on the island of Selina, the tallest and absolute of all of the archipelago. And here we find ourselves on Monte Fossa delle Felci, one of the first natural reserves set up on the Aeolian archipelago.
La presenza del castagno su una piccola isola mediterranea può destare una certa sorpresa.
The presence of the chestnut tree on a small Mediterranean island could arouse surprise. Its presence is probably due to an introduction that was perhaps made in the Roman era, and that was, in successive years, continuously replanted. The chestnut inserts itself in perfect harmony with the typical mark of the acidic volcanic soils, already existing in the area, and that principally consists of heather and arbutus berry. Here we have heather and arbutus berry, the undisputed protagonists of the Mediterranean mark of the Aeolian Islands. These antique handmade stone constructions, small refuges still in use in the reserve of Fossa delle Felci, retell how from the volcanic surveys the islands were intensely and extensively cultivated right up to the summit. It is an essential environment, extremely simple.
Le antiche saline dell'isola, lo stagno salmastro di Punta Lingue, costituiscono...
The ancient salt mines of the island, the brackish tin of Punta Lingua, constitute one of the few humid zones, probably the most important of the Aeolian Islands. Today, the salt mine is abandoned, and in its place remains one of the few humid areas of the archipelago that offers rest and refuge to the many species of migratory birds during their flight between Africa and Europe. For this reason, under the directive Natura 2000, this area has been recognized as having special protection under the European Union. The island of Selina is currently characterized by two principal volcanic structures of cone-like formation, the Monte dei Fossa delle Felci, the highest point of the Aeolian Islands, and the Monte dei Pori. The Greeks, in these volcanic structures, saw two similar cones and called the island Didyme, from the Greek twins. 430,000 years ago, there emerged from the sea of the first volcanic products belonging to the two most ancient centers of Pizzo de Corvo and Pizzo Capo, located respectively in the western and eastern part of the island. The successive eruptions constructed first Monte Fossa delle Felci and successively the Monte dei Pori, and laid upon the old centers, contributed to the definition of the current twin formation of the island. However, the history of Salina is destined to follow with other important phenomena that between 30,000 and 13,000 years ago give life to another volcanic center near the Punta del Perciato, Pollara. The explosive activity of the eruptive center of Pollara on the northwest side of the island generates an ample crater in which there forms a lake that is subsequently filled by eruptive activity and by meteoric waters. This phenomenon occurs in many volcanic islands. Erosion plays a decisive role in changing the face of the volcanic apparatus of Salina. Here is added erosion caused by the action of the sea. At Pollara, this process is still today particularly intense and evident.
Questo lago si riempie di materiale sia sparato dall'attività esplosiva del vulcano sia...
This lake is filled with material, be it material discharged from the explosive activity of the volcano or the erosion of the sides of the upper part and come to form those layers that we see today, destined to be degraded again through the erosive action of the sea. Arriving at Pollara by sea, one can observe the evidence of the rapid marine erosion from the suspended valleys that have been carved at the base of the old crater. The marine erosion is so rapid and aggressive that it continuously draws back the tall cliff and carves the depths of these incisions. The fight between Hephaestus and Neptune continues. Between the construction of the volcanic structures and the marine erosion, this can also be seen from the terraces created by the sea, when this was at differing levels respective to the current level. In many parts of the Aeolians, we can in fact recognize ancient beaches that geologists identify as marine terraces. Erosions, cuts, depressions are very frequent phenomena of the Aeolians. The position of the islands in itself conditioned by the presence of the long faults from which in time magma flowed. These faults also contributed to dismantling, the crumbling and the collapse of portions of volcanic apparatus. A singular structure of the Cana that projects northwest of Filicudi is the wreckage of a primordial volcanic center destroyed by erosion. It concerns the principal lavic conduits from which emerged the magma. The ancient volcanic cone has been eroded, and only the part most resistant to erosion has remained, the neck. The birth and the successive dismantling of the volcanic center of Lacana occurred in the space of around 1,000 years. The island of Filicudi began to form around 400,000 years ago with the construction of small centers in the northwestern sector and with the construction of the imposing cone of Montefassa delle Felci. It follows then with the extrusion of the lavic dome of Capo Graziano, which is the location of an important village of the Bronze Age. The last eruptive activity occurred around 70,000 years ago with the extrusion of Duomo della Montagnola.
Il cappero è una pianta che potrebbe essere considerata il simbolo delle Eolie, ma in realtà
The caper plant could be considered as symbol of the Aeolians. Indeed, it could be the symbol of the Mediterranean islands. The great distribution of the caper plants in the dry walls is due to its consumption by native lizards, who eat the fruit and scatter the seeds in the small ravines of the rock, assisting in the distribution. It has diverse culinary uses, and usually the flower buds are used, the true caper before the opening of the flower, or the consumption of the concuncho, which is the mature fruit. Around 120,000 years ago, the first volcanic products came out of the sea, from the island of Alacudi. According to scientists, this volcano, 2,000 meters in height from the bottom of the sea, last erupted 28,000 years ago. The collapse brought about the sinking of a part of Panarea that further changes the physiognomy of this island. Panarea began to form around 150,000 years ago and completed its formation in around 50,000 years. The shallow waters present between Panarea, Bazzaluzzo, and the rocks around Dattilo, Lisca Bianca, formed part of the great structure that at one time would have been immersed and perhaps would have been the island of Ionomos, as sustained by the great French naturalist Dolomieu. Plunging into these shallow waters, it is possible to return beyond the sub-oceanic exhalations that testify residues of volcanic activity, even the remains of constructions of the Roman era that are 3 meters in depth. That which remains shows that the phenomenon of sinking is recent and perhaps even in action. the splendid inlet of Calaunco is dominated by Punta Miliazizi, where one can find one of the most fascinating prehistoric villages. The pastel shades of the houses of Panarea seem to want to compete with the colors that Mother Nature has given to the islands.
Questa lucertola nera è una delle specie più minacciate dell'intera fauna italiana.
The black lizard is one of the most threatened species in the entire Italian fauna. It is a species exclusive to the Aeolian archipelago, but today survives on 3 small islands: Strombolicchio, Lacana at Filicudi, and Scoglio Verleone in the Bay of Pollara at Salina. While it has disappeared from the major islands as a result of competition from another species of the same type, the rural lizard, many are the morphological aspects, such as this black coloring, as defined by experts in this field, and the ventral coloration that verges on red brick, especially in the part under the tail, along with the presence of blue variegations under the sides. The eruptions constitute an environment of extraordinary interest from a botanical point of view. In this case, at Strombolicchio, we find diverse species suited to the life of eruptions, such as the carnation, Aianthus rupicula, and another of extraordinary interest, the Granata rupicula, that is considered to be the rarest species of the entire European flora. The lighthouse of the Mediterranean, as was defined by the ancient navigators that plowed through these waters, presents an alternating history, and many are the curiosities little known that relate to this volcanic apparatus. Starting from the name that is derived from the Greek strongheil, that means round, for its perfectly conical form, and from its continued activity of rhythmic projections of incandescent material. Strombolicchio, like Lacana of Filicudi, is nothing but the lavic vent of an ancient volcano later dismantled by erosion. And right on the submerged layers of the ancient volcanic apparatus of Strombolicchio, emerging from the sea, a small island destined to become most famous, Stromboli. The volcanic apparatus of Paleostromboli that originated 85,000 years ago was very different in form and dimension to that island that we see today. It extended more to the south, and it formed in more phases of activity that ended around 35,000 years ago. Subsequently, something disturbing happened on this island. The Paleostromboli divides almost in half and sinks into the abyss. The event must have been sudden and catastrophic, and the consequences easily imaginable. A huge tidal wave must have hit the coast of the neighboring Sicily and Calabria, with disastrous consequences, even in the regions that were further away. The collapse of the northern side of the island, however, did not involve the magmatic vent, and the new effusions gave life to Neostromboli, which is still active. The eruptive mouths hang over the Sierra del Fuoco, a structure of gravitational slides that periodically brings to the sea entire portions of the northwestern of the island, with tidal waves such as in December 2002. It is a long time since obsidian was an important economic resource for the islands, just as Stromboli is no longer a reference point for navigators. But these pearls of the Mediterranean today deserve to be further valued. It is time to give these islands that added value that comes from a fascinating natural history and from a fascinating history of man that perhaps saw the birth of a dawn of its path here. But today, the Aeolians are not only that which we have reported, but they are much more. On these islands, there is a wise mix of nature, history, culture, and well-being. This is the success of the Seven Sisters, born of fire and sculptured by the sea.